In Malawi, the most dangerous thing you could be was a girl child. With child marriages on the rise, young girls were being robbed of any future they could have imagined, until a woman nicknamed the Terminator stepped into power and ended 3,500 child marriages. For a second story, we'll go back to World War II Poland, where the most selfless woman of the Holocaust smuggled 2,500 children out of a Nazi death zone in potato sacks, and almost nobody knew her name for 60 years. For a third story, a woman discovered she had been poisoning her own baby through her breast milk, and then exposed a deadly factory secret the Kenyan government did not want anyone to find out. This is the story of three women who used their position of power against all odds to drive change that their countries will never recover from in the best possible way. Picture Malawi for a moment. A landlocked country in southeastern Africa, roughly the size of Pennsylvania, home to about 20 million people, and for a long time, quietly holding one of the most devastating statistics on the continent. 1 in every 2 girls in this country would be married before she turned 18. That means you could walk into any classroom of girls, pick 2 at random, and statistically, one of them would be pulled out of school, handed to a man, and expected to become a wife before she was old enough to vote, drive, or in many cases, finish puberty. And for a very long time, this was simply how things were done. The practice was woven into the cultural and economic fabric of rural communities. Families received a bride price in the form of livestock, money, goods, all in exchange for their daughters. It wasn't considered cruelty. It was considered survival. It was how poor families got by, how alliances between villages were cemented, how girls were protected from the unpredictability of poverty. And because traditional authority in Malawi is held at the chieftainship level, not at the national government level, it was almost impossible for any outside law to reach in and touch it. So for decades, no one really did. Until 2003, when a woman named Theresa Kachindamoto came home. She had been away for 27 years, working as a secretary at Zomba College in Zomba district, far from the rural Dedza district where she grew up. She was neither a politician nor an activist. She had never run a campaign, never written a policy paper, never lobbied anyone for anything. She typed letters, managed files, and by every external measure, lived a quiet and unremarkable professional life. But when the senior chief position of the Dedza district opened up after Theresa's elder brother died, the chiefs in the district came to a decision. They don't want a military man or a politician. They wanted Theresa, an ordinary secretary. When they told her she had been chosen, she asked why. They said she was good with people. She took the position. And almost immediately, it became clear that the chiefs of Dedza district had no idea what they had just handed her. Within months of taking office, Theresa Kachindamoto did something that no one in the district could quite believe at first. She called a meeting with the 52 sub-chiefs who reported to her across the district's 545 villages. These were mostly men. These were men who had been running their communities the same way for decades, enforcing the same customs, presiding over the same transactions, signing off on the same arrangements that moved girls from their parents' homes to their husbands' homes at 12, 13, 14 years old. She looked around that meeting and told them directly, no more child marriages. She wasn't aiming for a gradual phase-out or even a pilot program. It was clear and direct. Starting today, no more child marriages. Lorum did not respond well. Some of the sub-chiefs nodded and went home, but kept doing exactly what they had always done. Some openly refused. Some argued that this was their culture, their tradition, their right as community leaders to manage the affairs of their people, and that a woman who had spent the last 3 decades typing at a college in Zomba had no standing to walk in here and dismantle something that predated her authority by generations. And here is where Theresa Kachindamoto did something that nobody in the history of that district had seen a senior chief do. She fired them. She actually removed them from their positions and replaced them with people who would comply. And she was just getting started. Theresa began building what she would later call her Secret Mothers Network. It was a system of female informants embedded across every one of the 545 villages in her district. Women who would quietly report back to her when a child marriage was being arranged. The purpose was to intervene before the ceremony happened. In communities where the arrangement had already been completed, she convened councils and annulled the marriages. The girls would go home, would go back to school, and the bride price would be returned. Between 2003 and the time journalists began tracking her work in earnest around 2015, Theresa Kachindamoto had annulled over 3,500 child marriages. 3,500. Amazing, right? This is not a statistic. These are 3,500 girls who went back to school. 3,500 families whose daughters did not enter their teenage years already pregnant, already responsible for a household, or already removed from every future they might otherwise have had. And she did it without new legislation, without international funding, at least not initially, and without the national government. She did this within her authority and power as the senior chief, and rightfully earned the nickname, the Marriage Terminator. When interviewed by the Nyasa Times in 2014, she said, and I quote, "I don't want youthful marriages, they must go to school. No child should be found loitering at home, gardening, or doing any household chores during school time." There is something almost startling about the plainness of that statement. There was no diplomatic language nor appeal to international human rights frameworks. Just go to school. That's it. That's the whole argument. And she enforced it like she meant every single word. What she was up against, though, was never really just the sub-chiefs who pushed back. It was the logic underneath everything. The economic desperation that made families see their daughters as assets they couldn't afford to keep. A poor family in rural Malawi was not selling their daughter because they were cruel. They are often doing it because they cannot feed her otherwise, or because they genuinely believe that marriage represents a form of safety and stability for a girl in a world that has given them no other way to provide those things. Theresa understood this. She didn't pretend it wasn't real. In fact, to combat this, she went ahead to work with the organizations that could address the economic root, like Girls Not Brides, UNICEF, local development programs, and the likes, to make sure the families who agreed to send their girls back to school had some material support to make that possible. Her approach inspired other chiefs, and 12 signed her charter banning child marriage. Then more followed. The ripple effect moved outward from Theresa district across the country in ways that are still being documented. In 2015, Malawi passed a constitutional amendment raising the legal marriage age to 18 for all, a law that advocates had been trying to pass for years. Theresa Kachindamoto was not the only reason it passed, but she was one of the most visible reasons the ground had shifted enough to make it possible. In 2017, she received the Vital Voices Global Leadership Award in Washington, D.C. One of the few times the work she had been doing in the red dust of Theresa district was recognized on a global stage. She wore her traditional robes to the ceremony. Her favorite saying was this: "Educate a girl and you educate the whole area. You educate the world." She said it in village meetings. She said it to sub-chiefs who didn't want to hear it. She said it in Washington. She kept saying it until it stopped being something people argued with and started being something they repeated back to her as if they had always believed it. She passed away on August 13, 2025, in Kamuzu Central Hospital in Lilongwe. When Girls Not Brides issued a statement saying, "We've lost a hero on ending child marriages, a true patriot of a girl child." She was 66 years old when she died and was survived by her 5 sons. Her impact was so powerful that several of the families who resisted her most fiercely at the start eventually came around. Some sent their girls back to school themselves. Theresa Kachindamoto came home as a secretary. She left as the woman who changed what girlhood means in Malawi.
And more girls will go back to school.
Meet Irina Stanisława Sendlilova, also known as Irina Sendler, maiden name Kachinowska. But for this story, I will refer to her as Irina Sendler. She was a 4 feet 11 inches tall social worker in early 1900s Poland. She looked like an ordinary woman, except she would go on to save more than 2,500 children from the Holocaust. And for 60 years after she did it, almost nobody knew her name. Irina grew up in Otum, a small town about 15 miles outside Warsaw, where half the population was Jewish. Her father, Dr. Stanisław Kachinowski, was a doctor who ran a tuberculosis sanatorium there. And what everyone who knew him remembered was how he treated whoever came through the door, rich or poor, Catholic or Jewish, regardless of whether they could pay. Most doctors in Otwock at the time would not touch poor Jewish patients. Her father did not understand that logic. His philosophy, which he passed to his daughter like an inheritance, was simple. If you see someone drowning, you have to give a hand. He said that to her often. She was 7 years old when she watched what it cost him. In 1917, a typhus epidemic swept through the town's poorest community. Dr. Kachindamoto kept treating patients. He contracted typhus from one of them and died. Her father was so loved that after his death, the Jewish community of Otwock sent a delegation to the house and offered to pay for Irina's education. Although her mother declined, that gesture stayed with Irina long after childhood. She carried it into everything she did as an adult. By September 1939, when German bombs began falling on Warsaw, and the city Irina had grown up loving started disappearing block by block, she was 29 years old and working as a social worker for the city's Department of Social Welfare and Public Health. When the occupation authorities ordered that Jews be removed from the department's staff and barred the department from providing any assistance to Warsaw's Jewish citizens, Irina and a small group of colleagues kept doing it anyway, although quietly. Through forged documents, inflated case numbers, and false names on welfare rolls. Between 1939 and 1942, she and her circle produced over 3,000 false documents to keep Jewish families fed and housed and alive inside a city that was being reorganized around their destruction. Then, in November 1940, when the Nazis occupied Warsaw, they built a wall intending to keep 460,000 people, nearly 30% of Warsaw's population, sealed inside 2.4% of the city's land. And at this point, Irina lost access to them. But fortunately for her, she worked for the health department, and the Nazis, who feared typhus spreading from the ghetto into the rest of the city, needed someone to go in and check for disease outbreaks, so they issued permits to health department employees. They handed Irina Sendler a pass to walk in and out of the Warsaw ghetto whenever she needed to. She used it every single day. She went in carrying food hidden in the false bottoms of bags, typhus vaccines sewn into the lining of her coat, money tucked into clothing, sometimes candy or toys for the children. At that point, the daily food ration the Nazis allowed them was 181 calories. A body needs around 2,000 to survive. By August 1941, more than 5,000 people a month were dying of starvation and disease inside those walls. Irina made it her mission to do whatever she could, within her capacity, to provide help for them to the extent that any time she was inside, she wore a Star of David armband. Then, in July 1942, everything changed. The mass deportations from Warsaw to the Treblinka extermination camp began. By September of that year, roughly 300,000 people had been loaded onto trains and sent northeast to their deaths. The ghetto was being emptied, systematically and fast, under the fiction of resettlement in the east. Irina knew what that fiction covered. And what she understood was that the children were going to be among the last to be protected and the first to die. So she joined Zegota, which was the clandestine Polish Council for Aid to Jews, in late 1942, and was appointed head of its children's department. And under the codename Jolanta, she began doing something incredible that earned her the nickname, the Polish Angel. Irina walked into homes inside the ghetto, homes where people were already starving, already watching their neighbors disappear onto trains, and asked mothers and fathers to give her their children with the promise that she would get them to the other side of that wall, and she cannot promise them anything else. It was a difficult decision to make for most of the parents, that some declined while some asked her to come back and then changed their minds. Some said yes immediately, because they could see what was coming and understood that handing their child to a stranger was the only option left that wasn't certain death. Some parents broke down completely at the moment of separation and then collected themselves, because they had no choice but to collect themselves. Irina carried all of those moments with her for the rest of her life. The methods she used to get the children out were extraordinary in their improvisation. Infants were sedated and placed inside carpenters' wooden boxes, toolboxes, and potato sacks. A 5-month-old baby, named Elżbieta Fikowska, was carried out in a carpenter's crate. Older children were walked through the basement of an old courthouse on the edge of the ghetto that connected to the Aryan side of the street. Some left through an ambulance, hidden under stretchers, and one of Irina's colleagues trained a dog to bark on command at the checkpoint, covering the sounds of children who couldn't stay quiet. Some went through a Catholic church that straddled the ghetto boundary, in through the door on the Jewish side, out through the door on the free side with a new name. Some Jewish boys had their hair dyed, Some were dressed as girls to avoid being checked for circumcision at the gate. Every single exit from that ghetto was a calculation made in real time, with a German soldier somewhere in the picture. On the other side of the wall, Irina had built a network of people, roughly 25 core volunteers, mostly women, and 200 convents, orphanages and private families across Warsaw and the surrounding countryside who agreed to take children in. Each child received a Polish name, forged documents, a new religion, a rehearsed story. Irina taught the children to say the Lord's Prayer and the sign of the cross, because a German guard might test them at any moment. And every night after the day's work was done, she sat down and wrote their real names on thin strips of paper. Their Jewish name, their parents' names, the address where the child had been placed. She encoded it, folded it, and buried it. First, she kept the lists at home, prepared each night to throw them from the kitchen window if the Gestapo came. Eventually, when that felt too dangerous, she sealed everything inside glass jars and buried them under an apple tree in the garden of her friend Jadwiga Piotrowska, across the street from the German barracks. Her reason for doing this was that when this is over, these children will need to know who they were. Their parents might survive. There might be someone left to come looking. She was not just saving their lives, she was trying to make sure their lives would still belong to them when the war ended. On October 20, 1943, the Gestapo came for her. She had been under surveillance. Someone had talked. The precise source was never confirmed. When the officers arrived at her apartment, she managed to stash the most current list of names she had been working on, along with a large sum of Żagota's money, before they took her. She was taken to the Pawiak prison, one of the most feared detention facilities in occupied Warsaw, and interrogated. The Gestapo broke both of her feet and her legs. They wanted the real names of the children, the names of her network, the addresses of the children, and the identities of the people helping Żagota operate across the city. She gave them nothing. Then they sentenced her to death. On the day scheduled for her execution, members of Żagota bribed a German guard. She was released and walked out. The Gestapo listed her officially on the public bulletin boards as executed. She assumed a false identity and kept working, in hiding, for the rest of the war. When the war ended, she went back to Jadwiga's garden. She dug up the jars. The lists inside were intact. She and her colleagues spent years cross-referencing those names against the chaos of post-war Poland, tracking down children who had grown up in convents and foster families, finding any surviving relatives, attempting reunifications that the Holocaust had made almost impossible. Most of the parents had not survived. Many children grew up, were shown a jar's worth of paper, and learned for the first time who they really were. After the war, Poland's communist government treated members of the wartime resistance, including Żagota, with suspicion and hostility. Many rescuers were interrogated, imprisoned, or simply silenced. Irina kept quiet about her work for decades, because speaking about it was genuinely dangerous. She had been recognized by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem as righteous among the nations in 1965. But that recognition barely traveled beyond Israel. The story sat, unexhumed, for another 3 decades. Then in 1999, in a rural town in Kansas called Uniontown, a teacher named Norman Conard showed his students a 2-line reference to Irina Sendler in a magazine article. 4 teenage girls, Megan Stewart, Elizabeth Cambers, Sabrina Coons, and Jessica Shelton, started pulling on that thread for a National History Day competition. Their teacher thought the number was a typo when they saw how many children she had saved. They assumed 2,500 meant 250. No one person could do that. They looked anyway. They wrote to Irene. She wrote back. They traveled to Poland to meet her. What they found became a play called Life in a Jar, named for the method Irina used to preserve the children's identities, and the play toured schools across America and Poland for years, and slowly the story of what she had done began to surface into the light. She received Poland's highest civilian honor, the Order of the White Eagle, in 2003, when she was 93 years old. And then she died on May 12, 2008, in Warsaw. She was 98, survived by her daughter and granddaughter. In one of her first letters to the Kansas girls, she wrote, "My emotion is being shadowed by the fact that my co-workers have all passed on, and these honors fall to me. I can't find words to thank you, for my own country and the world to know of the bravery of the rescuers." At the end of her life, the children she had saved, now elderly themselves, still called and visited her. She never stopped insisting that she had not done enough. "I could have done more," she said. "This regret will follow me to my death. Every child saved with my help is the justification of my existence on this earth, and not a title to glory." This extraordinary woman saved 2,500 lives, refused to give up a single name under torture, helped the children reconnect to their origins years later, and then spent decades quietly asking herself if she had done enough. Maybe you can answer her in the comments. And that is the story of Irena Sendler, the Polish angel. On the outskirts of Mombasa, Kenya, there is a place called Owino Uhuru. The name, in Swahili, roughly translates to freedom, which is one of history's crueler ironies, because by the time this story ends, Owino Uhuru will be anything but. It is a densely packed slum, home to roughly 3,000 people, living in rows of small, mud-walled houses, pressed so close together that what one family breathes, the next family breathes too. Most of the people who live here work with their hands, earn very little, and have no realistic option to live anywhere else. They send their children to school through the narrow lanes between homes. They collect rainwater from corrugated metal roofs. They cook, bathe, and clean, using water from streams that run through the neighborhood. This was not poverty as abstraction. That was the lives of a community of real people, adapting in the only place they could afford. And then in 2007, a factory moved in next door. Metal Refineries EPZ Limited was a lead-acid battery recycling plant, which, if you don't know what that means, here is the short version. Old car batteries contain lead, enormous amounts of it, and there is a global market for extracting that lead and selling it particularly as solar energy. Storage boomed across East Africa, and demand for lead skyrocketed. It was a very profitable business, and it was also incredibly toxic, especially when it is done without proper safety equipment and waste management. In countries with strictly enforced environmental laws, the United States, for instance, lead smelters are required by law to use filtration devices that capture the fumes before they reach the air. At Metal Refineries EPZ Limited in Owino Uhuru, according to later investigations, none of that equipment existed. The lead extraction process works like this. They take used batteries, feed them into a furnace, burn off everything that isn't lead, and collect what remains. And the factory ran its furnaces mostly at night. Whether that was operational preference or deliberate strategy, burning after dark to avoid detection, nobody can say for certain. What the residents of Owino Uhuru can tell you is what night looked like from inside their homes. Thick black smoke pouring from the chimneys after sunset, fumes seeping through window gaps, and settling in enclosed rooms until families had to go outside just to breathe. Acid rain, actual acid rain, falling on the neighborhood, mixing into the soil, eating through the corrugated metal roofs, contaminating the water people collected in barrels below. A resident named Rose Obuya later told CNN, "We used to get rainwater from the roofs. We used to use it for domestic consumption, drinking, cooking, bathing. But all of a sudden, we realized that the rainwater has a bitter taste." Lead levels in the soil of Owino Uhuru increased nearly tenfold within the first 12 months of the factory opening, and nobody from the government came to tell them why. This is the world Phyllis Omido walked into in 2009. She was a young single mother, born in 1978 in Kidney, in Vihiga County, far from Mombasa, far from Owino Uhuru. She had built herself a professional life with care and deliberateness, and when she was offered a position as Community Relations Manager at Metal Refineries EPZ Limited, she took it. It was a good job. It was the kind of opportunity a single mother in Kenya in 2009 did not walk away from. One of her first assignments was to complete an environmental impact assessment, an EIA, for the plant. This is a standard requirement under Kenyan law before an industrial operation can be licensed. The assessment is supposed to determine whether the plant poses a risk to the surrounding community. Phyllis assembled a team of experts. They gathered the data, and she wrote the report. What the report found was damning. The factory's location left the roughly 3,000 residents of Owino Uhuru dangerously vulnerable to lead exposure. Her recommendation was unambiguous. The plant needed to be relocated. Management read the report. Then they removed her from the project and brought in a different consultant to write a different one. However, she was allowed to keep her job. She kept her head down, and approximately 3 months into her employment, her baby boy, King David, started getting sick. It started as vomiting. then a fever that spiked daily and wouldn't break. She took him to the hospital. Doctors tested for malaria. It came out negative. Tested for typhoid, still negative. Even tested for rotavirus, also negative. They ran through the standard list of everything that makes a baby in Mombasa dangerously ill, and came up empty every time. Until a colleague at the plant suggested, almost in passing, that they test for lead poisoning. The doctor agreed to try. King David's blood came back at 35 micrograms of lead per deciliter. For context, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control considers anything above 5 micrograms per deciliter a cause for concern. Her son was at 35. The doctor told her he had most likely ingested the lead through her breast milk. She had been feeding her baby poison through her own body, without knowing. Take a moment with that. Because Phyllis Omido did. She told CNN years later, "My son was sick, but I was also not feeling good. Our eyes at the factory would be watering, and the smell from the factory was pungent. It got me thinking about what they were producing there." She took her son's doctor report to her direct managers, and they offered to pay King David's medical bills, which had ballooned past $2,000, an amount completely out of reach for a single mother on a community relations salary. And in exchange, they asked for her silence. She accepted the money. She needed it. Her son needed it. And then she did the opposite of what they had paid for. Phyllis quit her job. She started cleaning houses to make ends meet. And she went back to Owino Uhuru. What she found when she started asking questions was not a mystery. It was an open secret that an entire community had been quietly swallowing for 2 years. Children running fevers that wouldn't respond to treatment. Women were suffering miscarriages and stillbirths at rates that nobody could explain. Chickens were dying after drinking water from streams near the factory.
And they have ascertained that she died because of the lead poisoning in Owino Uhuru. We continue to lose babies, we continue to get miscarriages in the community.
She picked 3 children from the neighborhood at random and took them to be tested. All 3 came back positive for lead poisoning at 12, 17, and 23 micrograms per deciliter, respectively. And that is just 3 random children. She founded an organization, the Center for Justice, Governance, and Environmental Action, known as CJGEA, registered it in 2009, and began doing what nobody with actual power in Kenya had thought to do. She went door to door. She accompanied parents who couldn't read to hospital appointments, so she could explain the situation to doctors on their behalf. She compiled data. She documented deaths, miscarriages, and test results. Altogether, Omido later told CNN she recorded 79 deaths in Owino Uhuru from lead-related ailments, including 46 children. She also recorded 124 miscarriages between 2010 and 2014 when the smelter was in operation, although the actual figure was never verified. She wrote letters to the plant's management, to the National Environment Management Authority, to anyone with a license or a desk who was supposed to care about this. Nobody responded, or rather, nobody helped. The government agency that had licensed the plant to operate in the middle of a residential slum had no particular interest in acknowledging what that license had enabled. The plant management, having already paid for Phyllis's silence once, apparently assumed the matter was resolved. So she escalated. She organized street protests. She led demonstrations outside the factory gates. And in April 2012, as she was assembling workers and residents for one of those protests, police arrived and arrested her. 16 members of her organization were taken in alongside her. The charges against her, in my personal opinion, was ridiculous. She was arrested for holding an illegal gathering and inciting violence. The CJGEA offices were raided. Documents and computers were confiscated. After a night in jail, she appeared before a magistrate who eventually dismissed the case entirely, ruling that she had acted within the law. But the message from whoever had sent the police was not subtle. It got less subtle. Later that same year, 2 armed men intercepted Phyllis and her son outside their home one evening. She and King David managed to escape, and she moved to an undisclosed address where she had to set up CCTV cameras, and she also started carrying a small GPS tracker in her purse at all times. She received threatening text messages from unknown international numbers for months. Text ranges from "Stop talking about the Owino Uhuru case" to pure death threats. She installed 3 locks on her front door and a security alarm. She did all of this and kept going. She took her case to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxic Waste. She represented Kenya's human rights defenders at a conference in Dublin in 2013. She attended the Universal Rights Group Forum in Geneva in 2014. She showed up at Yale for a UN conference on environmental governance. She found pro bono lawyers from an organization called Advocates Sans Frontières in Brussels who agreed to help her build the legal case. She was doing all of this as a single mother, living in hiding, cleaning houses when the funding ran out, never once with the resources that the government or the company had available to make her stop. But then, in January 2014, Metal Refineries EPZ Limited ceased operations. And it wasn't because of a sudden crisis of corporate conscience, or because the government finally acted. It was because Kenya, around that time, made the export of scrap metal illegal, which gutted the factory's business model. The community's struggle alone had not been enough to close it. But the struggle had created enough noise, enough documentation, and enough international attention that when the legal mechanism arrived, there was an entire case already built and waiting. In 2015, Phyllis Omido was named one of 6 recipients of the Goldman Environmental Prize, the largest prize in the world for grassroots environmental activists, and received $175,000. She put most of it into CJGEA. The organization went on to force the closure of at least 10 other toxic smelters operating in similar conditions across Kenya. The lawsuit she filed against the Kenyan government and the plant's owners, accusing them of violating Kenyan environmental and human rights law, worked its way through the courts for nearly a decade. In July 2020, a Kenyan court ruled in favor of the community of Owino Uhuru and awarded them $12 million in compensation. The court also ordered the government to clean up the contaminated site within 4 months. $12 million is not $30 million, which is what Phyllis had asked for. She told the BBC, "We are grateful for what we got. It will go a long way in helping the community in terms of health, getting medications to the community, and also help in the sustenance of food, because they need special food to help their bodies heal." There are women in Owino Uhuru who had their wombs removed because they had carried babies who died from lead poisoning, and their bodies could not carry another pregnancy safely afterwards. There is no financial settlement that reaches that. Phyllis has said so directly. You can never compensate for a lost womb, but they need to take responsibility. The part that baffles me when researching this story is that the factory that poisoned Owino Uhuru operated on a license issued by the Kenyan government. It was built in the middle of a residential community without a proper environmental impact assessment. The one Phyllis herself had written was discarded, so a more favorable version could replace it. The people who lived in Owino Uhuru were poor, unconnected, and living in a slum, which meant the calculation at whatever level it was made was that their suffering was an acceptable operating cost. Nobody factored in that the woman they hired to protect that factory would use that exact position to dismantle everything they had built on top of a poisoned community. Today, Phyllis Omido is still fighting, now taking on Kenya's plans to build a nuclear power plant on the country's coast, still carrying the same GPS tracker, still refusing to sit down. Her organization, CJGEA, has shut down 17 toxic sites across Kenya. And that's the story of Phyllis Omido, former factory employee, house cleaner, and accidental activist, who ended up being the reason communities across an entire country breathe cleaner air. Thanks for watching. If this story inspires you in any way, drop your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear which of these women is your hero. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. See you in the next video.